The fluorescent lights in the preschool classroom always hummed with a low, persistent frequency that only became noticeable when the room emptied out. By 5:30, the chaotic symphony of building blocks, spilled juice boxes, and high-pitched laughter had faded into a heavy, sterile silence. There was only one child left. He sat perfectly still on the tiny yellow chair by the window, his small hands folded over his knees, his gaze fixed on the asphalt of the parking lot. I stood by the cubbies, meticulously aligning the stray markers and sanitizing the tabletops. Order was my sanctuary. My entire life was built on a rigid architecture of schedules, predictability, and control. And then there was her. She was always late. When the heavy glass door finally groaned open, she would practically fall into the room, a whirlwind of frantic apologies and disorganized energy. Her hair often escaped its hasty clip, her trench coat was perpetually missing a button, and the dark circles under her eyes looked like permanent bruises. She never made eye contact with me for more than a second. She would scoop up the boy, her words tumbling out in a rushed, breathless stream, and vanish back into the twilight. From my vantage point of spotless perfection, I observed her with a cold, silent judgment. I categorized her easily in my mind: careless, disorganized, perhaps too absorbed in her own chaotic world to prioritize the quiet little boy who waited so patiently. I prided myself on my dedication to these children, and her daily tardiness felt like a personal affront to the standards I held so high. I did not know her, yet I had already written her entire story in my head. The parent-teacher conference room smelled sharply of floor wax and stale coffee. I sat across the low table from her, my posture perfectly straight, a neatly organized file folder resting beneath my fingertips. The boy was making excellent progress, but the agenda I had prepared focused entirely on home stability. I chose my words with the surgical precision of someone who believes they are entirely in the right. I spoke in measured, professional tones about the importance of routine, the psychological impact of punctuality on a child's sense of security, and the necessity of active presence. I never raised my voice. I merely let the weight of my carefully constructed, passive-aggressive implications settle heavily in the small space between us. She did not defend herself. She sat frozen, her hands tightly gripping the frayed strap of her worn canvas tote bag. I watched the skin around her knuckles turn a stark, bloodless white. Slowly, a dark, uneven flush crept up her neck. When she finally looked down, a single tear broke free, tracing a silent path down her cheek before dropping onto the scuffed linoleum floor. She hastily wiped her face, murmuring a fractured, barely audible apology, and left the room. I remained at the table, the echo of the closing door ringing in my ears. A strange, metallic taste of guilt flooded the back of my throat. The victory I had anticipated from doing my professional duty was entirely absent, replaced by a sudden, uncomfortable awareness of my own cruelty. The atmosphere between us turned to ice. She still arrived late, but the frantic apologies ceased. Instead, she moved with a mechanical stiffness, deliberately keeping a wide physical distance from me. Yet, stripped of my self-righteousness, my perception began to shift. I started noticing the details my prejudice had previously blinded me to. I saw the way her hands shook violently when she signed the dismissal logbook. I noticed the faded, fraying edges of her sleeves, the fact that she wore the same scuffed loafers in the freezing rain as she did in the dry autumn wind. I saw the fierce, desperate tenderness with which she pulled the boy's collar up against the cold before stepping out the door. My perfect, orderly world suddenly felt profoundly hollow. I was a spectator standing safely on the shore, criticizing the swimming technique of someone actively drowning. I wanted to say something, to bridge the cavernous gap I had dug between us, but my pride and my inherent awkwardness kept my lips sealed. I watched her struggle from afar, trapped in the prison of my own making, realizing slowly that my judgment had been nothing more than a shield against the messy, unpredictable reality of human suffering. The phone rang just as the final bell echoed through the empty hallway. The caller ID displayed her number. I stared at the flashing screen, my heart executing a strange, heavy thud against my ribs. When I answered, her voice was barely recognizable, a tight, thin wire of pure panic. She was trapped at her workplace, a sudden emergency locking down her shift, and the transit system had completely halted. The desperation in her breath transmitted directly through the receiver. She asked the unthinkable, begging me to take the boy to her home. Every protocol, every boundary I had built around my professional life screamed at me to refuse, to call social services, to follow the manual. But the memory of her silent tear on the linoleum floor anchored me to the spot. The hesitation lasted only a fraction of a second. A quiet, undeniable instinct overrode my rigid rules. I agreed without a second thought. I walked back into the classroom, where the boy was quietly drawing a heavily shaded house. I packed his crayons, zipped up his small jacket, and took his hand. As we walked toward my car, the crisp evening air felt entirely different. I was stepping off the shore, wading into the unknown waters of her life. The apartment building was tucked away in a decaying part of the city, the concrete steps cracked, and the hallway smelling faintly of old moisture and cheap cooking oil. The boy handed me a brass key, his small face unreadable. I turned the lock and pushed the door open. The air inside was thick and stagnant. My eyes adjusted to the dim light, and the reality of her existence struck me with the force of a physical blow. The cramped living room was divided in half. On one side, a small pile of neatly stacked toys and a worn rug. On the other, a heavy medical bed occupying almost the entire space. An elderly woman lay there, her gaze fixed on the ceiling, completely immobilized. The dining table was buried under towering stacks of medical bills, past due notices, and amber prescription bottles. A crumpled shift schedule, marked with 3 different job locations and back-to-back 12-hour days, peeked out from under the pile. I walked toward the kitchen, my chest tightening with every step. I opened the refrigerator out of a desperate need to find something normal. It contained exactly 2 cartons of expired milk, a jar of pickled vegetables, and blinding, empty white space. I stood in the center of the cramped, freezing kitchen, the silence of the apartment pressing down on me. The realization crashed over me, crushing my pristine ignorance. She wasn't careless. She was a single mother fighting a solitary, brutal war against an avalanche of tragedy, an ex-husband who had stripped them of every penny, a paralyzed mother, a young child, and a body pushed to the absolute limits of exhaustion. I cover my mouth with both hands, the shame of my past arrogance burning hot tears into my eyes. I did not leave. The instinct to retreat to my quiet, spotless townhouse evaporated, replaced by a fierce, driving need to mend the broken pieces in front of me. I moved with quiet, methodical purpose. I took the boy to the corner grocery store, filling the cart with fresh vegetables, meats, fortified milk, and a small box of the chocolate biscuits he kept eyeing. Back in the apartment, I rolled up my sleeves. The act of cleaning became a silent penance. I scrubbed the stained countertops, gathered the scattered trash, and organized the chaotic mountain of medication into distinct, manageable rows, labeled clearly with dosage times and instructions. I started a stew on the stove, letting the rich, savory scent of garlic and simmering broth slowly chase away the smell of antiseptic and despair. I approached the medical bed with gentle hands, carefully wiping the elderly woman's face with a warm cloth, adjusting her pillows, and murmuring softly to her until her rigid posture relaxed. The boy sat at the freshly wiped table, eating a hot bowl of soup, his eyes wide as he watched the space transform. I worked until my back ached and my hands were raw, channeling every ounce of my unspoken apology into the physical labor of care. The lock clicked open long past midnight. She stepped into the apartment, her shoulders slumped, her gaze fixed on the floor, bracing herself for the usual overwhelming chaos. She stopped dead in the entryway. The soft glow of the kitchen light illuminated the clean surfaces. The scent of hot food hung in the warm air. The boy was asleep on the sofa, covered in a thick blanket, and the rhythmic, peaceful breathing of her mother filled the quiet room. I stood by the kitchen counter, suddenly unsure of my place. She looked at me, her eyes tracking the neatly folded laundry, the filled refrigerator, the steaming pot on the stove. The tough, defensive shell she wore every single day fractured, cracking down the center before completely shattering. She took 2 steps forward and collapsed against me. I caught her, wrapping my arms tightly around her shaking shoulders. She buried her face in my collarbone, the suppressed agony, the sheer exhaustion, and the immense terror of her daily life pouring out in ragged, silent sobs. I held her firmly, my hand pressing against the back of her head. No apologies were spoken. None were needed. In the heavy stillness of the night, holding the weight of her broken world, we crossed the invisible divide. I became the anchor she never knew she was allowed to have. The dynamic between us shifted profoundly. The polite, strained distance was replaced by a quiet, fierce synchronization. I no longer observed her life from the outside. I wove myself into its very fabric. I learned the exact timing of her multiple part-time shifts. While she worked the late hours, I became the silent orchestrator behind the scenes. I prepared the boy's backpack, packing nutritious lunches and folding his small sweaters with deliberate care. I picked him up when she was delayed, sitting with him at my kitchen table, guiding his hands as he painted, ensuring he felt a constant, unwavering presence. I found myself changing, too. The rigid, solitary perfectionism that had defined my life began to soften, replaced by a deep, grounded sense of purpose. Her resilience became a mirror reflecting my own capacity for endurance. She never asked for help, but she learned to leave the door unlocked for me. We developed a language of unspoken gestures, a hot thermos of coffee left on her porch, a brief, tight squeeze of the hand during drop-off. I was no longer just a teacher. I was her fortress, standing firmly between her and the relentless tide of her reality. The fragile equilibrium we had built was violently disrupted on a Tuesday evening. I arrived at her apartment to find her sitting perfectly still at the dining table, staring blankly at a crumpled piece of thick, watermarked paper. It was a legal notice. Her ex-husband, the man who had vanished with their savings, had resurfaced. Armed with a ruthless lawyer, he was filing for full custody, citing her unstable financial situation and inadequate living conditions as grounds to declare her unfit, entirely to evade the massive accumulation of unpaid alimony and child support he owed. He had even sent anonymous, threatening messages to her workplace, trying to get her fired to further his case. I watched the sheer terror hollow out her eyes. The man was weaponizing the very poverty he had inflicted upon her. The systemic injustice of it tasted like ash in my mouth. She looked at me, her hands shaking violently, convinced that this was the end, that the mountain was finally too high to climb. A cold, absolute clarity settled over me. Sympathy was useless here. Grief would not protect her. I reached across the table, took the crumpled legal threat from her shaking fingers, and smoothed it flat against the wood. I looked her directly in the eyes, my expression hardened into stone. We were not going to be victims. My kitchen became a war room. The dining table, usually adorned only with a vase of fresh flowers, was now buried under tax records, bank statements, and printed statutes. I leveraged every connection I had from my college days, bypassing the bureaucratic red tape, to reach a prominent legal aid clinic that specialized in predatory domestic cases. We sat side by side, bathed in the harsh blue light of my laptop screen until the early hours of the morning. I methodically organized the evidence of his financial abandonment, tracking the timeline of his withdrawal, even uncovering hidden bank accounts he had used to hide his income. When panic seized her and she tried to retreat into a shell of defeat, I anchored her. I spoke in low, steady tones, mapping out the strategy, refusing to let the shadow of her past dictate her future. We documented every hour she worked, every medical bill she paid, building an impenetrable fortress of paper that proved her immense capability and his absolute negligence. I wasn't just helping a friend. We were a 2-woman battalion dismantling an assault. She provided the raw, undeniable truth of her survival, and I provided the tactical armor to weaponize it. Together, we built a defense so solid it left no room for defeat. Just as her battle reached its peak, my own world unexpectedly collapsed. A highly influential, wealthy mother at the preschool took offense to my refusal to grant her child special, unearned privileges. Retaliation was swift. She filed a formal, vicious complaint to the school board, accusing me of inappropriate conduct and biased negligence, demanding my immediate termination. She even spread false rumors among the other parents, turning the once welcoming school hallways into a space of cold stares and whispered comments. The principal, intimidated by the family's financial contributions, suspended me pending an investigation. I sat on my immaculate sofa, staring at the blank television screen, the sudden silence of my house ringing loudly in my ears. The career I had built with obsessive perfectionism was unraveling over a fabricated lie. The self-doubt I had kept buried for years clawed its way to the surface, convincing me I was completely and utterly worthless. The doorbell rang. She stood on my porch, holding a steaming, battered food container. She didn't ask what happened. She just walked in, set the food down, and sat beside me. For hours, she stayed. When the school board requested a hearing, I was too paralyzed to prepare. She took my hands, her grip rough, calloused, and unbelievably strong. With the same fierce, unyielding grit she used to survive her darkest nights, she looked into my eyes and recited back to me every ounce of worth I had ever shown her. She became the immovable wall at my back, proving that the strength we shared flowed entirely in both directions. The hearing passed, her unwavering testimony and the meticulous documentation I usually applied to my classroom ultimately cleared my name. The experience forged an unbreakable, profound trust between us. We were no longer just surviving, we were actively reshaping our trajectories. Through the legal aid network, I discovered a position at a corporate back office, a job that offered substantial pay, full health benefits, and, most importantly, flexible hours that accommodated her mother's care. Getting her the interview was the easy part. Getting her to believe she belonged in that polished, corporate environment was the true battle. I brought over a tailored blazer I had worn in my previous life. I stood behind her in front of the cracked hallway mirror, carefully pinning the cuffs to fit her wrists. She stared at her reflection, her eyes filled with a deep-seated imposter syndrome. I stood firmly behind her, placing my hands on her shoulders. We spent the entire evening rehearsing. I anticipated every corporate trap question, coaching her to translate her superhuman multitasking as a caregiver into highly sought-after project management skills. I didn't fix her. I simply held up a mirror so she could finally see the brilliant, capable warrior I had known all along. The phone call came on a Thursday afternoon. The heavy, anxious silence in her apartment was shattered by the sharp ring. I watched her face as she listened to the recruiter. The tension in her jaw slowly dissolved, replaced by a radiant, disbelieving light.
She got the job.
Simultaneously, the legal battle concluded. Faced with the airtight dossier we had compiled and the formidable legal aid representation, her ex-husband's lawyer advised an immediate retreat. He dropped the custody suit and was mandated to initiate the severe backlog of payments, with a court order threatening wage garnishment and asset seizure if he defaulted again. The suffocating shadow he had cast over her life was permanently eradicated. The rhythm of the preschool changed. The fluorescent lights still hummed at 5:30, but the atmosphere was fundamentally altered. When the door opened, she walked in with a steady, grounded pace. Her hair was neat, the dark circles had faded, and her eyes met mine with a profound, shared understanding. The boy no longer waited with the tense expectation of a forgotten burden. He waited with the calm certainty of a child who knows exactly how solid the ground beneath him is. Looking back, the evolution of our bond seems almost predestined, a collision of two vastly different worlds that entirely rearranged our internal landscapes. We started as strangers separated by a chasm of prejudice and systemic hardship, yet we forged a connection stronger than any bloodline. She dismantled the cold, isolated perfectionism I had used to keep the world at arm's length. She taught me that true strength does not lie in a flawless exterior, but in the messy, agonizing resilience of showing up, day after day, despite the heavy odds. In return, I offered her the quiet, steadfast stability she needed to catch her breath, the structural support that allowed her to stand tall and reclaim the narrative of her own life. We did not need grand declarations. Our bond existed in the silent spaces, in the shared glances over a crowded room, in the seamless way we anticipated each other's needs, in the absolute, unwavering certainty that if one of us began to fall, the other would already be there to catch the weight. We had become the architects of each other's salvation. In a world that often demands women tear each other down, we chose to be each other's fiercest shield. We built a safety net woven from absolute trust, proving that when women stand shoulder to shoulder in the dark, they become the very light that guides them home.